What's up guys, my name is Alex and welcome to Magic Missile Minis. Today I'm going to be teaching you guys how to make your very own custom D&D miniatures. This video is an updated version of a video that I had made a while back, and the last video is it's a bit old and there's actually things I've wanted to change about it for a really long time. There were some things that weren't super clear and just some quirks about the video that I wanted to iron out. So I decided to make a more updated version of this video to give you guys the basics of how to start making your very first miniature for D&D. The most important material you're going to need is green stuff. This is the name of the product. It is called green stuff. Green stuff is a two-part epoxy resin. What that means is that you take this yellow part and this blue part, which creates a chemical reaction that starts to make the green stuff set into a somewhat hard plastic, which makes it perfect for sculpting miniatures. The green stuff will be pliable and usable for sculpting for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then over the course of the next hour, it'll start to set and become a lot more difficult to use. You should be able to go on Amazon to find it, as well as going to most hobby companies have their own version of green stuff that comes in this kind of tape with the yellow and blue side attached to each other. Alternatives to this are things like clay, where it's a more of a oven bake style clay as opposed to the epoxy resin that green stuff is. I personally prefer using green stuff because you don't have to worry about baking it in an oven, but I know a lot of people make some really great minis using clay. I will say a question I get a lot is, can you use air dry clays to make miniatures? And unfortunately the answer is no. The problem with air dry clay is that it will always dry unevenly and very, very quickly at a small scale for a miniature. So you'll find as you're sculpting, it's just gonna fall apart in your hands as you're making it, as half of what you're working with is dry and half of it is already still wet and pliable and just kind of it just falls apart and is really difficult and kind of impossible to make miniatures out of. You are also going to want some rubber and metal sculpting tools. These are a must. You may feel as though you can get away without using them. That's how I felt when I started, but I really advise you get some sculpting tools because it's going to make your life so much easier. They're an absolute must. In order to create an armature, which I'll get to later, you're going to need some wire cutters, and preferably either some needle nose or some jewelry pliers like I have here. The wire that I'm using is 26 gauge wire. I believe it's steel. It says it's titanium color. I don't know exactly what that means, but it's a 26 gauge steel. It's generally fairly pliable and works really well for making miniatures. You're also going to need some super glue, some bases for your miniature, as well as some kind of sculpting handle. You can find some professional ones online. I personally have just been using these little cork bottles I got at like a dollar store. I use the cork as a way to stab the wires into, and that's worked for me, and it's a lot cheaper of an option. The first step in making a miniature is making the armature for the mini. This will act as a skeleton for our miniature, so that as we're adding our first layers of green stuff, we have a solid foundation to work on. The scale that I'm going to be making these miniatures is a 25mm scale, which is based off of the miniature bases we're going to be using. You're going to start by taking a long piece of wire, roughly 5 inches or 12 centimeters, and folding it in half, clamping it down with some pliers. By holding the folded end with your pliers, you're going to start twist these two pieces of wire together and create essentially what's going to act as the spine. You're going to want the spine to be just over 1/2 inch or 1.5 centimeters. And then from there, you're going to bend out the hips, and that's going to be about 1/4 inch or 0.7 centimeters. For the legs, I tend to create this small notch to indicate where the knee is going to be and the separation between the thigh and the calf. And you're going to want the legs to be about 1/2 inch or 1.5 centimeters. And then very quickly you can bend out the feet. To make the arms for the miniature, we'll take another piece of wire about 3 inches or 10 centimeters long, and I'm going to bend a small loop into the middle. We'll then place that loop over the spine and then clamp that loop tight with our pliers. In order to make sure it stays there, I'll also add a little bit of super glue onto that joint. I'll then bend the shoulders to match the width of the hips, and then to create an indication for the hands, I'll bend the wires just underneath the hips. Before we add this to our sculpting handle though, I tend to pose the miniature. The first thing you want to think about when posing a miniature is bending the shoulders. People's shoulders are not just one straight line, they actually kind of bend out and move around from the collarbone. And so the first thing you want to do is bend out the shoulders to create some kind of pose that's more dynamic than having them be straight. If you go online and you look up action pose reference, you can generally find a bunch of drawings that is different exciting poses that you can use as reference when you're posing your miniature. Once you have your armature posed, you can add it to your sculpting handle and you can get ready to start sculpting. Green stuff doesn't love sticking onto wires, so your first step is always going to be adding a really thin layer of green stuff over the entirety of your armature so you can sculpt more details on top of that. Before we start adding details, I wanted to talk through three really important foundational ideas when it comes to sculpting miniatures. These are a handful of things that I wish I had thought of or known when I had started making minis. The first is use reference. Using reference can be incredibly helpful, whether that's art that you found online, or even better if it's another miniature that you really like. This will give you an idea of what kind of details minis generally will have, and will keep you from having to invent stuff in your head that ends up looking a little odd or misshapen for your final miniature. It really helps boost the quality of your mini when you have something that you're basing it off of. The second tip I want to give is to think about the definition or resolution of your miniature. This might sound a little odd at first, but the idea is, let's say you're photoshopping an image, and you have one image that's in 4K and another image that's in 720p. If you just slapped those images on top of each other, no matter how well you photoshopped them together, it would be very clear that one of them was in a higher resolution than the other one. And generally speaking, it would just make the entire Photoshop look weird and unnatural. So we want to think about the same thing when it comes to sculpting miniatures. If you can make one detail at 4K when you're sculpting, you should make sure that every other detail you're adding can also be at that high definition with all of that detail. Because if you can't make all the other details look that good, then it's going to make your mini feel a little off and a little odd. So it's honestly better to make sure the entire miniature is at the same resolution or definition than have part of it be really detailed and the rest of it be a little bit sloppy. So when you're making a miniature, keeping everything around the same resolution can be a really great way to make your miniature look really good. It's better to have a miniature at 720p than have half of it be in 4K and half of it at 720p. So hopefully that's a helpful little tip and a little metaphor to think about as you're sculpting your miniatures. And the last tip is to try to make sure that all the details you add are noticeable. As you add really fine details, they can blend in and make your miniature look a little bit difficult to figure out what's going on. So as much as you can, make sure the details you add are noticeable and distinguished from the rest of the details around them. But with those tips and tricks aside, let's get into actually sculpting this miniature. The first thing you want to think about is anatomy. Depending on what miniature you are making though, you may not have to do all of the anatomy for the mini. In the past videos I've made all of the musculature and done the entire thing and then started adding clothes. But honestly, if you're just going to give a character a shirt, you don't have to do all of the musculature over his torso. You can generally just do the arms if they're going to be exposed. Again, using reference for anatomy is super important. Even if you're just getting the basic shape and not doing the musculature, it still gives you a sense of what it's supposed to look like. So once you've done that, you can start adding details like clothing or armor. Keep in mind that those details like clothing or armor are always going to be a little bit thicker because you're working at such a small scale. You can't help but make clothing thicker than they normally would be. So making anything that's going to be covered, make it just a little bit smaller than it would actually be to accommodate for that difference in the thickness of armor or clothing. One thing you'll notice is I haven't actually added the head yet, and this is intentional because I always do faces separately from the main armature. I start by adding a basic oval shape that I loosely form into something kind of like a skull, so that's essentially what this first layer is going to act as. Then also we'll add two small half circles that are going to act as the eyes. keeping in mind that these have to be directly in the middle of the face. I would definitely recommend looking at references for faces. If you're gonna look at references for anything, looking at references for faces is super, super helpful because of how particular they can be. Especially, again, if you find a miniature you really like and look at the face of the miniature, it's even better than looking up photos of what a face actually looks like. Once that sets, I can start adding the other details. I always start with the brow so I can establish some kind of expression, and then I'll go on and add the under eyelids, the nose, the mouth, as well as a little bit of extra green stuff if I need to establish a little bit more of a chin or cheekbones. To add it onto the miniature, I let the face set, and then I just add a little bit of green stuff onto where the neck is going to be and attach it on. I don't mind not necessarily sculpting out a full head, because if I'm gonna add hair, it needs to take up a little extra space. After this step, it's time to make the miniature your own, adding any details that you think fit for the character that you're trying to make. If you need help for any of those specific details, I've got a ton of videos out there. I may be updating some of those to see if they need a little bit of a revamp, but I've got a lot of different tutorial videos talking about clothes, armor, in-depth looks at anatomy and faces, weapons, all kinds of things. So I really encourage you to go to my channel and check all of those out. In the comments, I'd love to hear any ideas for other how-tos you want me to make. But hopefully this video has given you all the foundations that you're going to need to make your own miniatures and start getting into this hobby that is sculpting miniatures by hand. If you like this video, please leave a comment, subscribe, do all of the things, check out my Patreon. All of that stuff is super, super helpful for supporting my channel, so I can give you guys more tutorials, more how-tos, and you guys can check out all the different sculpting projects that I'm working on. A little bit of self-promotion, I also have a band, it's called Kin, K-Y-N. This is what one of our songs sound like.
Friends for years, and if not, it's enough that we both hate it here. So hold on, let's rock it.
And if you like that sound, I'd really appreciate it if you checked out our Instagram and checked us out on Spotify. But all of that aside, thank you so much for watching this video, and I really hope to see you again soon.